Again, everybody, we've got bright sunshine here this morning, hence my squint. Sorry about that. As you can tell, this is not a Gardner. This is actually a Dennis petrol engine out of a very old Dennis fire tender. We installed a Gardner 4LK in this fire tender for an Australian customer some years ago, and I thought that work would make an interesting YouTube video. Before we go on to the fire tender itself, I'm just going to take you around this engine here because it's got some really quite interesting features. The first thing we notice here is that each cylinder has two spark plugs. The reason for this is that there was both a conventional distributor system on this engine and a magneto. I believe the reason for this was just added security. If they were in a big hurry to get to a fire, they certainly didn't want trouble from the engine, and she needed to be easily started. So it's a real belt and braces job. Here we have the gearbox. This was, as far as I remember, a 4-speed or possibly a 3-speed crash gearbox. It was horrible to use. This is where the starter was mounted. Here we have the usual water pump and water outlet. Sorry about the shadow here. This is our air intake here. Round this side, conventional exhaust system. An oil cooler down here. On here we've got the drive for the magneto, and I'll show you the magneto now shortly. Conventional dynamo. Another view of the spark. Here we have the carburetor from the petrol engine. I think it's an SU, I'm not sure. No, it's a Zenith carburetor with the butterfly valve. Here we have the magneto. My understanding is that this generated high voltage electric for one set of the spark plugs. And here we have a conventional distributor with its 4 spark plug leads and its central high tension. And here we have the coil. Here we have the starting handle. I didn't point that out, but of course that starting handle goes onto the front of the engine. And I was able to swing her. I was able to start her on the handle. Here we have a conventional starter and an air filter. The Dennis, she was being prepared to go into the container before leaving Australia. Tucked away safely in the container, ready for shipping out to Ireland. We might as well start at the beginning. Here's the fire tender arriving. I think this was in 2013, I'm not too sure. Notice New South Wales on the side there, and the beautiful brass water pumps from the original function. They weren't all there. Some of them were missing before she arrived here. The garden, by the way, has nothing to do with me. My wife looks after that, and an old school friend of mine. That's a generator on the top there that the customer used for powering a leisure centre and powering audio equipment on this vehicle. Look at the lovely polished chrome on the front and the headlights. Absolutely gorgeous. And the leather seats. Wonderful. And the painted spare wheels. That's where the firemen sat on those side seats. Remain shows the engine and gearbox quite late in the day. We had by this stage restored the 4LK Gardner, and we fitted this Zenith gearbox. You'll remember that the original gearbox on this vehicle was a very old-fashioned crash gearbox. Well, we went from one extreme to the other here. This is a very modern ZF automatic gearbox. And it came with a very clever piece of electronics, an electronic module whereby you could program what RPM it would change gear at. It was all very neat and very elegant. Really quite pleased with the performance of that gearbox. A front view of the engine with the gearbox. A couple of things to notice here. Notice the red subframes that we had to build there to hold the engine in the engine bay. Notice there's no shaft-driven alternator here. Notice also that the starter on the 4LK is opposite from a conventional LXB and LW engines. Here we see the 4LK, the Gardner 4LK actually installed in the engine bay. You'll notice a high output alternator here, and despite the size of the pulley, it was working quite well, charged the batteries quite well, and had sufficient output for lights and so on. Notice the bar at the top, that's the stabilizing bar for the radiator. Now, it's not impossible at all that we could have dispensed with the radiator in that instance, because we were able to do that with the Land Rover project that we did subsequently. But I suppose as this vehicle is going to be working in Australia, where it can get particularly hot, it's perhaps better to retain the radiator. We had sufficient room in the engine bay anyway. The vertical rod shown here was actually operated by that cable at the top. As the cable came under tension, it rotated the rod and moved an arm at the bottom, which in turn moved the throttle. That's how we managed to activate the throttle here. The throttle on the original engine, of course, as luck would have it, was on the other side. This is the throttle inside the cab. As you can see, it was designed for your typical big, healthy Australian firefighter. There was no problem with leverage or any torque problems there. You'll notice that the clutch pedal is gone. I'm sure the operators in Australia are very glad to see the back of that. As with the throttle JPEG, this shows you how much the 4LK impinged back into the cab of the fire tender. As you can imagine, we had a lot of fancy bodywork and boxing to do around that to blend that into the vehicle and keep it in keeping with the vehicle. We had some trouble with the starter in this engine. We found that the 12-volt starter was really a bit lazy, so we decided to install a 24-volt starter. So we had to employ a relay to switch that starter on once the key was turned to the S position. You can see the relays here. This clip shows my family and extended family having a bit of fun on the vehicle during a birthday. The proof of the pudding, of course, is in the eating. I know from cycling up this hill that it really is very steep. You'll hear the Zenith gearbox changing gear as the fire tender approaches.
That's all I have for you on the fire tender. The vehicle itself is long gone back out to our customer in Australia. It works out there on a leisure centre somewhere near Sydney, where it entertains the crowds by spraying water and things like that, and it has attracted a lot of attention. The poor Dennis is now redundant, so if there's anybody out there interested in vintage petrol engines, perhaps you can get on to me. It'd be nice to find an appreciative home for it. So I hope you got something out of that. I know we certainly learnt a lot and really enjoyed putting the Gardner in the fire tender. It was a lot of fun.